Alright, we have some interesting things to talk about today. So about a week before the day this video comes out, Anthrocon, the largest furry convention in the world at the time of this recording, made a bit of an announcement outlining some things that would be changing about the con going forward. Now, conventions making announcements about updates to their cons is nothing new, but this one was pretty significant. If you recall, this year's iteration of the con set the worldwide record for the largest furry convention ever held at well over 17.6 thousand people. And while that is an amazing accomplishment on its own, it wasn't without any issues. Getting hotels close to the convention center was stressful. There were many instances of crowding where people with ADA accommodations couldn't get to their accommodations. And of course, it was highlighted by the registration line, which left many attendees stranded in the Pittsburgh sun for more than 4 hours. There were a lot of pain points that the con experienced and the leadership team noticed. So about a week ago, the con chairman made a video outlining some key changes to help keep AC running as best as possible for the foreseeable future. And some of these changes are pretty significant, stuff that we've never seen at any furry convention before, ever. So I wanted to take a look at what this announcement said, try to understand the reasons behind these changes, and take a look at the bigger picture and see how this might be the first of many changes to furry conventions and indeed furries' actions toward convention attendance as well. Let me explain. And let's just start by looking at what was announced by AC last week. The con chairman posted a video on YouTube explaining the changes in detail, and while I'm not going to clip from it due to copyright, I'll link it as well as the corresponding blog post with everything outlined in the description of this video. What I am going to do is basically summarize the changes and try to make sense of them and put them all into context. So let's just go in order with the first and arguably most important announcement of them all. Yep, Anthrocon 2025 will have a registration cap for the first time ever. What this basically means is that there will be a limit on how many people can register and actually attend the convention, which, if I recall correctly, is the first time this has ever been done at any furry convention ever, not just AC. Now, while this is definitely the headline announcement, there's still something missing here, which is actually a theme of most of these announcements as we'll get into later. And the thing that is missing here is what exactly that registration limit is going to be. Now, they did give us a hint and mentioned that it will be bigger than the attendance of last year, so we could safely assume that the number will be larger than 17,639. But that's all we know. The new limit could easily be 17,640, or double that, well into 35,000. It's probably going to be a nice round number, but all we could do is guess at this point, which I think is what they want us to do. My guess is that they actually don't have the number settled yet, and are going to be monitoring how pre-reg and specifically hotel room registration goes before settling in on a number that they think their staff and expected volunteer help can manage. Now, I'll be honest, I kind of saw this coming, and while the explosion of popularity of furry conventions has been exciting at a high level, it's causing a lot of strain on the resources that cons have. So from AC's perspective, managing their growth is something that kind of makes sense to do. I guess this also means that you probably have to decide a little bit earlier if you can make it to AC next year or not, but if you pre-reg once you know that for sure, I wouldn't really worry about running into that registration cap until weeks leading up to the convention itself. But we're actually going to stay on the topic of registration because the second announcement that AC made for next year regards just that. This one is a bit curious if I'm honest. The registration line on Thursday will only be for people who pre-registered for the convention. Now, I'm sure this is in response to the atrocious line outside the convention that there was to register last year, where people were baking in the Pittsburgh sun for upwards of 4 hours just to get their con started. I think the idea is to take the people who were registering on site out of that line, so it's just a line for people essentially picking up their badges, which makes sense on paper, but I'm curious about how big of a fix this will actually end up being. Now, they obviously have data that I don't have, but it seemed like a vast majority of people who were in that line were pre-regged attendees, meaning this change wouldn't really affect that specific situation. In fact, I know a number of people who purposely didn't pre-register so they could skip the line and go straight to the on-site registration, a line that took a fraction of the time and was worth the $20 extra or so to not have to wait out in the sun. So I'm a bit curious to see if this, along with their brand new registration software, actually makes a noticeable difference in the reg line, which I believe is a more structural problem with how registration at conventions goes in the first place, but I've already made a video on that, so you can go check out my thoughts on that there. So let's keep moving and move on to their third announced change. This one is a pretty open and shut case for me. It sounds like they're addressing some feedback that people had about the hotel shuttles and are addressing it with a more accessible system. It seems pretty straightforward, and it's kind of hard for me to dive deep into since I just hoofed it from my hotel room and back, but I'm privileged enough to be able-bodied and able to do so. So I hope that these improvements do help make AC a better experience for everyone. And while that one was easy to explain, this last one is the one that I think is the most controversial. Let's take a look. Long story short, the fursuit parade is also getting a reduction and a hard participation limit, which on its own is fine and makes a lot of sense from an organizational standpoint. But it's that next part that is interesting to dive into. AC will have, quote, standards for participation to help manage the parade safely. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that's quite a loaded statement. Standards for participation. This goes back to what I said when I was talking about the attendance cap, where their lack of specific language leaves us to interpret this however we want. And as you might have guessed, having standards on the fursuits that can participate in a parade ruffled a lot of feathers in the community. Because again, that can mean a million different things. Are they only going to allow full suiters to participate, leaving out those who can't afford or otherwise can't handle the heat of full suiting? Are they only going to allow original characters and not suits of already franchised fictional anthropomorphic animals? Will they only allow digitigrade suits, suits from certain makers, and actual suit heads and not things like cardboard boxes? Only allow people who can walk in suit without a handler or any other accommodations? Who knows? And I'm sure it's not going to be as drastic as any of those ideas, but all I'm doing is using what we're all given, which isn't a lot. So we're just left to speculate. I guess that's the downside of making an announcement of an announcement. With all of these changes, it's not uncommon for people to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. So a registration cap, pre-reg only pickup on Thursday, more accessible shuttles, and an overhaul to the fursuit parade. Those are the patch notes that Anthrocon announced last week for 2025's iteration of the convention. Honestly, each of these changes can warrant its own video, but with all the missing data, like what the registration cap is actually going to be, what other changes to the entire registration process are they looking to improve, what the new and improved accessible shuttles look like, and especially what the new fursuit parade standards mean. There's just not a lot of ways that we can come to any conclusions on if these changes are good or not. And I have no doubt in my mind that that was done on purpose. We could criticize the lack of information, but we can't knock them for any specifics. So they're leaving it up for interpretation until everything is completely narrowed down. That's good PR, and I will give them that. So the next best thing that we could do is bring this back up to a high level and try to look at why this is all happening in the first place. And while I think this is the biggest splash in this pond, these changes are a result of something about furry conventions that has been simmering for a while now. In their current state, the growth rate of conventions in this fandom is unsustainable. What do I mean by this? Well, from my perspective, we are quickly approaching peak furry convention, insofar that the way that the cons are designed and operated can't grow much more. Otherwise, it would be too overwhelming for the systems that they are currently built upon. And we're already starting to see some of the seams rip. The best example that I could give is registration. That is the biggest pain point for so many convention goers, and because cons are volunteer-led, there's only so much person power that can be thrown at this problem. So what ends up happening is people will look at other conventions and other fandoms and throw out suggestions like, why not mail out the badges? Seems like a pretty easy fix, right? Well, the thing about mailing badges is that takes a lot of work and effort behind the scenes to get that right. Work that is hard to get out of a bunch of volunteers who have other things to worry about in their lives. So you might think, oh, just pay them. But again, that runs directly against how furry conventions operate. If you pay your staff, that money has to come from somewhere, meaning you can exponentially increase your registration costs to a number that's unsustainable to keep a convention populated, or you could get that money from somewhere else. For other cons and other fandoms, that somewhere else is external sponsors, corporations that pay the con in exchange for name recognition and some special privileges at the con itself. Though if you've spent any time in this fandom, you would know that furries don't want anything to do with that at their cons. But the flip side of keeping corporations out of furry is that there is only so much money that can be used for our events, which brings us all the way back to the first issue. Most, not all, but most cons can't mail badges because they simply don't have the resources. They can't afford the time or the money to do so. It's the same thing with hotel rooms. Furries are unique in that having a hotel close to the convention center actually makes a big difference. Costuming isn't nearly as big of a deal in other fandoms, so getting a hotel that's a driving distance away isn't a problem. But for us, especially us fursuiters, getting the main hotel could make or break someone's entire decision to attend a convention or not. So that's great and all, but what does this mean for us as convention attendees? Well, like everything else that happens in this fandom, we're going to adapt to the failing foundations of our furry festivities and start to change our outlook and overall behavior towards attending cons. Now, I can only guess how this shakes out, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a couple of things happen in the next few years. One, all of those mid-sized cons, the ones with attendance numbers in the 3,000 to 8,000 range, they're going to get quite a boost. I think there is an effort amongst friend groups in this fandom to try to go to smaller cons together instead of the bigger ones, so they can actually see each other more than once throughout the weekend. Building on top of that, secondly, I think some groups are going to take this even further and host smaller but more concentrated furry events on their own. So instead of going to multiple cons a year, they might go to one and then get a bunch of their friends and friends of their friends to host an event of their own somewhere private, like a cabin in the woods. And while I don't think the big cons are going to start dropping in attendance anytime soon, most of them are still the best option for most people coming in internationally, I think their growth acceleration is going to be much smaller than the cons right below them in attendance. And while the timing of these changes is on the scale of years, I think we're starting to see the very beginnings of this behavioral change. And it's not just with Anthrocon. There were a lot of frustrations with Midwest Fur Fest this year and their hotel lottery, which, amongst all the other things, probably boils down to the number of attendees wanting a room, overwhelming their systems and the staff in charge of handling all of that. All of this is to say, if there's anything I will give AC credit for, it's saying the quiet part out loud. Being the largest furry convention looks great on paper, but with just how cons in our community are structured, I think they're the first to just openly admit that they're starting to reach their limits. And while I'm sure more information about the specifics of their announcement will come out over time, and maybe we'll revisit them in more detail when we get those details, it's clear that Anthrocon still has the best wishes of their attendees in mind and are doing what they believe is best to keep the experience of everyone who attends as magical as possible. And as someone whose favorite convention is Anthrocon, I really do wish them the best as they plan for this new, unprecedented iteration of their con and hope that they achieve their goal in keeping Anthrocon really for everyone. Alright, that's been it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy deep dives into things about the furry fandom like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for doing so. I'll catch you all in the next one, but until then, stay wild out there. Peace.